Hello everyone, welcome back to the TJOmega channel for daily video number 901. Yeesh. So before we begin, let me give you a little bit of a heads up. If you're watching this on Thursday, we are going live with Scheduled Conflicts, the live D&D show I take part in over at the Goblins channel on Twitch. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to come watch. Please do. My character's in a lot of trouble right now. I also want to mention that it is the last day of the month, so yeah, tonight I'll be recording for the AMA that I do every single month. So please go check my previous one if you want to leave a question. I will be cutting those off late tonight. I'm a night owl, so you got a little bit of time, but this offer expires like literally probably in a few hours, depending on when this video goes online. So there you go. There's my announcements. Let's get to the topic. So we know next year's toy line. We know like what is most likely the beginning of a brand new trilogy of Transformer toys, and it is revolving around the 13 primes. Now, those primes have been in fiction and have been circulating around for so long now, but very few of them have proper toy representation. Many of them are relegated to just those tiny little Titan Master wannabes they did in Power of the Primes, which doesn't really get across the whole, Transformer deities thing. So I'm really curious to see what we're actually going to get as far as what the 13 are finally going to canonically look like in toy form. However, before we even get to that, we need to actually do a little bit of history diving because not a lot of people are aware of the 13. In cartoons, they usually come one or two at a time at most, and the same is true in the comic books. So getting a unified set of 13 has been something of a challenge. So today we're just going to kind of go over the initial history of them, as well as a brief rundown of who they are, why they're important, etc. This is just a history lesson to get you up to speed before we have an entire toy line dedicated to these characters. Now, before we begin, that's like the third time I've said that today. Third time in this video. There is one thing we do have to get across, and that is the concept is not unfamiliar even before the 13 were properly explained in full. There is a previous concept from the BotCon days during the 3H run, where in 1999 they created the concept of the Covenant, 12 original Transformers first created by Primus, the originals of the Transformers line, and those were all based on Zodiacs, so that kind of made sense for the 12. And while the Covenant shares DNA and similar concepts to the 13, canonically they are not linked and have never been linked. That pretty much just stayed in the 3H fiction for that brief period of BotCon. That said, there is another little catch to this. There are multiple versions of the 13. In some fictions, you will find some of these members switched out for other ones, like Logos Prime, who ended up being the last Autobot from the Marvel comic books. Things like that, just depending on what the fiction wanted to do and how they really wanted to adapt certain characters. IDW switched out a few of these for their depiction in 1.0. The point being, we are going to be sticking with the original version from the Covenant of Primus, meaning even though these guys are not connected to the original Covenant, these are known as the Covenant 13, because as we know, naming conventions in Transformers, especially series-wise, has to be just a little bit confusing, right? So let's go with their original story. So we know this by now because this has kind of become the broad origin story for Transformers at this point. You have a battle between Primus and Unicron, these two like omnipresent deities in spirit, duking it out in spiritual form. And eventually the battle ends when Primus tricks Unicron into bonding with an astral body, and thus Primus ending up trapped in one as well. Over time, Unicron learns to adapt his into the gigantic robotic form we know of, so that he can continue to consume the universe, whereas Primus formed his body into what would eventually become Cybertron and gave rise to 13 robotic beings with powerful artifacts that were designed to fend off Unicron and, kickstart an entire race of robotic beings. The conflict with Unicron is actually what caused a lot of the schism inside the 13 to eventually form. A little touch of corruption that made all of them deviate in their own ways, depending on just how bad it was for them, into losing trust in each other, starting to create plots against each other, various things going on. So suffice to say, it's not a happy family, and it's a family that eventually went their own ways. We'll get to that in a bit, but I think at this point, it's the appropriate time to kind of go over the roster itself, and then we can actually start getting into the greater storyline of them and what exactly happened. And that starts with Prima, the very first Transformer being ever created. Prima was the leader of the 13, and if Dungeons and Dragons was a thing in the universe of Transformers, this is your lawful good paladin. He is justice. He is the heroic warrior, and believing himself as well as his siblings to be the lawful good of the universe, outside of the later beings created by Primus, who he sees as more chaotic and potentially evil themselves. He carries 2 artifacts. Well, technically 1. He is the wielder of the Star Saber, the original Star Saber. Of course, powerful sword in and of itself. You can't really have an 80s franchise without some kind of powerful magical sword, after all. But eventually, a piece of it, the hilt specifically, would become an artifact of its own, being the Matrix of Leadership. Encompassing the wisdom of all Autobot leaders, all the way from Prima and all those following after. So there's your fun origin. So let's continue with probably the most well-known of any of them. That's Alpha Trion. Of course, this is where you start realizing not all of these characters are created specifically for the 13. There are many of them that are taken from various characters over the years that kind of fit the mold. And when you're talking about an ancient scribe of wisdom and clarity, then Alpha Trion is going to come to mind. He's one of the few 13 who remained on Cybertron throughout its existence, and became kind of the archivist. He is the knowledge keeper of all Cybertron, recording all events. His artifact is twofold. He gets the book, The Covenant of Primus, which is very oracle. It is very much a telling of future events, very prophetic, as well as a quill that allows you to write in the book and create new events to happen in the future to a limited degree, which would make this one of the most powerful of all of the relics. Even a slight alteration to the future can have massive ramifications. And thankfully, it's someone as calm and collected as Alpha Trion that actually manages to keep a hold of that and thus not go out of control with that kind of power. Vector Prime is another one that was adapted into the 13, obviously from Transformer Cybertron, but he was probably the first character we saw in fiction that actually showed what he could potentially do as such a powerful being, being able to manipulate space and time at will. He keeps himself, again, calm, collected, but more importantly, balanced. He sees himself as a balance keeper in the universe, a force of order, if you will. To that extent, his relic is the Blades of Time, which do allow him to travel through dimensions and across time and space as needed. So again, incredibly powerful relic, wielded by someone who is a little bit more responsible with it than I would potentially be. Now, he's one that I don't really have to describe too much because we pretty much know Vector Prime. We got probably the best look at him of any of the 13 because he exists all throughout the run of Transformers Cybertron, maintains the same personality in the Covenant of Primus version of the character, and it's the only time, it's the first time, really, we got to see something with the power of the 13 in action. Alchemist Prime is a character we would later call Macadam, whether that was in the Transformers Cyberverse cartoon or even in the early comic book depictions, again being a character adapted for future use. Alchemist Prime is probably the most gentle of any of the 13, even-tempered, friendly, and viewing himself something of a student of the natural world. He is by far the most spiritual of any of the 13, and it's kind of exemplified in the lenses that he wears, which allows him to perceive physical and spiritual cycles of the universe. I'm not even sure I know exactly what that means, but needless to say, it has made him incredibly perceptive. He is the one that, again, remains on Cybertron. We know him as Macadam, a simple bartender there to listen to your problems as any good, old-timey bartender is. And he makes for a masterful character when they used him in Cyberverse. I think, probably of the 13, probably my favorite that we've gotten a really good look at so far. And maybe that is because he's friendly. Maybe you trust the bartender with all your troubles, so maybe that has to do with it. But yeah, he's the mellow one of the bunch. Nexus Prime is something of a fun giant of a character. If you're familiar with Critical Role, he'd be your Grog. Kind of goofy, but huge, imposing, proud, and very powerful. Even unpredictable at times, but still good-natured, full of humor, which I always like. Even described as a bit of a prankster, though he's not the one known for that amongst these groups. He's fascinated by the change in status of matter, and that is exemplified by his actual design, which is described as always shifting and constantly moving around and adapting into different forms. Nexus Prime is the very first combiner, capable of separating his body into individual robots or allowing other robots to combine together. That's the Relic's work, the enigma of combination, named as such because it's intentionally kept a mystery in that it is just an object you can possess, preferring it to be something of a mystery of how combination works, as well as how to gain it yourself. Trying to be more like a puzzle more than just something you can go, tap, you are a combiner now. Good luck. Soulless Prime is the very first female Transformer and the progenitor of all following after her. She is the most creative of the 13, known for intelligence and positivity, as well as a fierce and quick temper at the sign of injustice. She enjoys creation, which does link her to some of the other primes who are also more devoted to the creation of certain things. But for her capabilities are thanks to the Forge of Soulless Prime, which allows her to create weapons and artifacts, including many of the powerful relics that the 13 themselves actually use, making it one of the first ever granted. Her creativity is responsible for things like the Star Saber previously mentioned, as well as other artifacts later on, like the Apex armor, the Terminus blade, the Enigma of combination, and a few others we haven't mentioned yet. Suffice to say, she is the creator among all Transformers, and it's a spirit that lives on in a lot of her ancestors and female Transformers that came after. The smallest member of the Primes and the progenitor of the Minicons, Micronus Prime, is a boundless ball of energy. Clever in mind and able to predict the actions and thoughts of his 12 brethren. He is known for just boundless energy and really quick thinking. So the fun part about him is that just like the Minicons themselves, he is capable of transferring energy. His relic is the Chimera Stone, which allows him to redirect all of his excess energy into whoever needs it at the time, especially amongst his 13. So he is very much a Minicon in that, and I would even equate him more to even like Micromasters, which are also creations designed for energy efficiency. So he kind of represents all of the smallest of the Transformers in that way. But in general, one of the more friendly ones, one of the more light-hearted and gentle ones, And again, one that we've actually seen in action, as the character did make an appearance in Robots in Disguise 2015. That's a whole other story, maybe another day. The very first Transformer to adopt an animalistic form, Onyx Prime, despite appearances, is one of the most kind-hearted and friendly of the 13, to the point where the others viewed him as a loyal ally no matter what they themselves were up to. He is probably the most spiritually connected of all the 13, even more so than Alchemist Prime. Feeling very connected to not only the natural world, but the spirit realm as well. To that end is his particular item, which is the Triptych Mask, which not only allows him to cast his own spirit across great distances, but also allows him to view sparks in the afterlife. This is an important thing. Write this little note down because we will be exploring this at the end of the video. Suffice to say, one of the coolest looking primes, and one that we got to look at in IDW 1.0, though their take on him is significantly different than what it seems to be here. But that's another story for another time, because that's a really involved plot, so we probably need to move past that one right now. Originally, the cliffhanger of the Generation 2 Marvel comic book, Liege Maximo patterns himself as the manipulator of the 13, equipped with a set of darts, the Legion darts, which basically just poison their targets. Honestly, for what is essentially the Transformers version of Loki, the artifact seems exceptionally weak, which is kind of unfortunate. Needless to say, he is the strategist among the 13, and very much unlike Liege Maximo from the G2 comics that viewed himself the antithesis of Primus and the ultimate evil of the universe. This one just likes to spin his own webs and manipulate things as he wishes to his own ends. That is very in keeping with the Loki comparison, especially as you observe the shape of those horns on his head. I don't think that was unintentional, by the way. Our most recent Prime in fiction is Quintus Prime, being the cornerstone of the Earthspark storyline, at least for the first season. Quintus is one of the smartest of the 13 and bristling with imagination. He is idealist and perfectionist, meaning he does butt heads a lot, but it does allow him to use his imagination to create all manner of things, as he is able to impart life into things with his Emberstone. He believes that life in all of its forms is the most important thing in the universe, and that regardless of whatever is going on or whatever the circumstance, life should be able to grow and adapt, which in the original depiction that we're going to discuss takes a little bit of a different turn, but it's definitely taken into different accounts when we come to the modern version of Quintus Prime in Earthspark. So again, there's deviations in how this Prime is depicted, whether he is a malevolent version of creation or if he has his own things going on. Amalgamous Prime is probably the one we have the least about, and I think that's just due to his overall nature. Among the Primes, he is the trickster, he is the prankster, so even more so than the one who's literally adapted to look like Loki. What plays into this is his very nature, which is to constantly shift forms, more so than even Nexus Prime, as he is the progenitor of the Shifters, the Transformers that are very rare in that they can change into just about any form they wish, regardless of their physical natural forms. So in fiction, the only time we've ever seen this was Makeshift in Transformers Prime, and we never got to see his true form. The closest you're going to see in action would probably be Frenzy or Laserbeak from the live-action movies, who could turn into anything from phones, copying machines, to tiny pink bumblebees. But because of that nature, which extends to his artifact, the Scythe, that can change shape and matter just as easily as he can, not only do I think this is just a very rare iteration of Transformers that we very rarely get to see, but also, how would you even animate it? Megatronus, probably one of the most infamous and one that has been used and adapted in the most fiction so far. This is a warrior first and foremost, powerful, prideful, and for a while, extremely loyal to Primus, though he has his own insecurities. He has his own faults and demons that he wrestles with, and after that taint of Unicron, that only seemed to get worse as those insecurities start leading into darker things. Suffice to say, you could mark him as one of the most powerful amongst the 13 as far as just being a warrior, including his artifact, which is the Requiem Blaster. Literally the most powerful cannon you could ever imagine, and it's just strapped to his arm. Why does this sound familiar? What adds a little bit of wrinkle to this is the fact that among the 13, he shares the strongest bond with one of them that is actually a romantic connection with Soulless Prime. It's something that would define Megatronus as a character, as well as start to undo the 13. And then there's the 13th Prime. This one is always intentionally left in mystery with his original form kind of shrouded the way you see here. Getting a good look at him and a proper depiction has probably been the most elusive of all of them. Even in the Power of the Primes toy line, they intentionally kept him kind of mysterious and hidden away. Now, this is one of those that's treated differently in different depictions. There are some that swap him out for other potential characters who could be a replacement Prime. However, the most common depiction of the 13th is the original form of Optimus Prime, the first to unite the 13 by raising a hand in friendship and being the uniter of all of them. When they broke apart, Optimus Prime decided to reduce himself down into a spark as a mortal Cybertronian, becoming Orion Pax, and eventually retaking the name, though not his original power or personality, when he obtained the Matrix itself. But for the most part, the 13th Prime is always left as kind of ambiguous, even in fictions where you kind of get the idea that it is Optimus Prime reincarnated. It's still not entirely clear if that's true. After the initial defeat of Unicron, the 13th set about setting Cybertron up and beginning the Transformer race and setting their earliest days into motion. However, we have that taint of Unicron to deal with. There are different cliques that are focused on different things. For instance, you have Vector Prime, Alpha Trion, and Primus, all kind of devoted solely to crafting Cybertron into what it would eventually become, whereas others have some of their own things going on. That includes some machinations by the likes of Megatronus, Liege Maximo, and Quintus Prime, who are in the process of creating their own race of mechanical life forms. Prima sees this as a more sinister thing, that this is potentially not, in line with what they are trying to accomplish. So they set it to a vote amongst the 13, and Megatronus loses it, and in a fit of rage, kills his love, kills Soulless Prime. This is all machination by Liege Maximo, who's trying to drive wedges in the 13, in particular Soulless and Megatronus. And whatever machinations he had in mind, he wouldn't live to see through, as in the ensuing fight between the remaining 12, he would be the one who didn't come out of it alive. Soulless's Prime rejoins the core of Cybertron and becomes the well of all sparks, whereas Liege Maximo is eventually laid to rest, leaving just the 11 behind. And now there is a schism between them, and now the unification of them and the direction of Cybertron isn't as well fit as they imagined. 3 of them, Optimus, Micronus, as well as Onyx, decide to use their relics to travel into the well of the Allsparks and give birth to what would eventually become the very first sparks born on Cybertron, which is also how you end up with a reborn Orion Pax at some point. The rest tend to go off into their own things. Some explore space, some, like Alpha Trion and Alchemist Prime, decide to remain on Cybertron and guide its ways. In particular, Alpha Trion taking a young Orion Pax under his wing to craft him into a new leader for Cybertron, knowing full well who he used to be in a former life. As for Micronus, that's a story that kind of goes in different ways depending on who's adapting it. In spite of his crimes, he's granted a level of leniency, given a ship to which to explore the galaxy in, something that even surprised Micronus. It was in hopes that he could find peace with himself, as well as find a way of honoring Soulless's memory if he is able to travel freely around the universe. That leads to certain things. He either remains in space traveling to this day and no one's ever heard of him for eons. He returns to Cybertron an even greater threat than Megatron ever was, or, as is most popular, he adopts the name of the Fallen, and eventually falls in with the power of Unicron and becomes essentially the Transformers version of Lucifer. Understand, Megatron named himself after the Cybertronian equivalent of the Devil, and even adapted his own tactic of strap the largest weapon you can to your arm and take over everything. But that in the general is what your 13 is. And obviously I'm truncating a lot of this. I'm simplifying it for the sake of getting it all into a watchable video. I'm suggesting TF Wiki for a lot of this. Frankly, it's where I'm pulling a lot of this information from, because otherwise the info on the 13 is so scattered. And like I said, many of them are gaining more well-known depictions because one or two appears in a cartoon or comic book at a time, and very few are left untouched so far, meaning that there are different iterations, the original concepts versus what they are now. Quintus Prime especially seems way nicer and is not doing anything sinister in his current depiction. So obviously there's a lot more to go, but I'll leave you to research for yourselves. For now, that's a rough summary of the 13. You're now prepared for next year's toy line. So, thank you very much for watching. As always, I will see you next time.